impressive build with a lot of counter spells like Force of Will, Daze, and even Stifle, which is kind of a cool one. So he could even have the chance to have the big blowout turn of Stifle the trigger on Terminus to, kill him in one shot with a bunch of pump spells. So it's going to be an interesting match for sure. I would probably take Brian, but it's going to be close.
And we watched Tom win a particularly impressive game 2 earlier against an Esper Stoneblade player who started off the game with a discard spell, a Stoneforge Mystic into Lingering Souls, into Umezawa's Jitte equip and hit you, put counters on it with Force of Will, and Tom was able to win the following turn.
I need you to ask me a question. I need you to ask me, how did Tom beat Lingering Souls? Ask me that question.
How did Tom beat Lingering Souls?
Berserker!
It did involve Berserk.
I haven't seen that card cast on camera in my entire life, and it was a delight.
One of the goodies from Alpha. And that's part of the charm of Legacy, still here keeping it real 20 years later.
Yeah, I mean, not to mention, you see the dual lands and things like that coming around, but whenever you see a gem like Berserk, which was once banned in my casual group because it was too powerful.
Was it too powerful in conjunction with Ball Lightning? Because that is why it was banned in my casual group.
Yes. Yes.
That synergy just proved too much for us to handle.
Yeah, that was too much for me too. So Berserk, soft spot in my heart for it. So I want to root for Brian because he's one of my best friends. But as far as decks are concerned, I'm going to root for Infect.
Some pretty iconic Dan Frazier random swirly background art as well. Just a real a tribute to a simpler time. Brian's going to be on the play here.
Yeah, have you
critical.
seen Stasis, the art on that? That's just like his aunt's random drawing or whatever, right? Garfield's like, hey, I need some art for a card.
I need a woman painting a dog or whatever's going on in Stasis.
All right, can we get Stasis on the screen? Come on.
All right, Brian looks like he's keeping, and as does Tom, and we are underway. Once we get the go-ahead from our spotter here.
All right, so Brian was 3rd seed, where Tom was 6th seed, so Brian will be on the play here. May be important in this matchup. The extra card could be a boon for Tom, though, giving him potentially the extra pump spell he needs to go along with an extra blue spell for Force of Will. Looks like he has the Berserk lying in wait in his hand. So
Tom with one main deck Berserk and then one more on the board. Just a Wooded Foothills for Tom. Brian with Tundra in play going into his 2nd turn. Looks like he has a pretty stocked hand involving counterbalance.
Yeah, he has a Force Will backup too, so if he sticks his counterbalance here and eventually draws a top or maybe even just blind flips, he could put Tom in a really bad spot early on. Though Tom, it looks like, had a crop rotation in his hand, so he could potentially crop rotate in response to go get Inkmoth Nexus and just start beating Brian for 1 every turn until Brian draws a Swords of Plowshares. But yeah, this game could shape up to be really interesting, and it's going to be fun to see Tom kind of dance around the counterbalance.
So, the namesake enchantment here, up Brian's deck, counterbalance entering play, and Tom decides to fight over this with Force of Will.
Yeah, and Brian could tank here and force back pitching counterbalance, but since he has the 2nd counterbalance, I think he'd rather save that Force of Will for a more important threat like a Blighted Agent or potentially just like Glistener Elf or something. So.
Wooded Hills here, sacrifice for Tom, adding Misty Rainforest to his board this turn.
Yeah, it looks like he drew Noble Hierarch. I feel like that's just going to be what he plays here. Kind of get his mana online so he has a little more flexibility later in the game with his pump spells. It also has the potential with Exalted to double the damage of his creatures. So.
And you see the Noble Hierarch from Tom, and passes the turn back to Brian.
Yeah, Tom's hand pretty stocked with pump spells right now. It looks like he has Invigorate, a Vines of the Vastwood, a Crop Rotation, and I don't remember, and a Berserk. So not a whole lot of, actual threats going on as far as Infect creatures goes, but he can always instant speed, end of turn, Crop Rotation for Inkmoth Nexus. Assuming Brian doesn't have a response, could just pump spell him out of the game next turn.
Yeah, that is an interesting dynamic that Tom's deck has. The ability from no board to kill you through crop rotation at the end of your own turn.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, Brian's hand contains Academy Ruins, Counterbalance, Force of Will, a Jace the Mind Sculptor, which I feel like in this matchup could just get pitched to the Force of Will. I think, a Brainstorm. He might not actually have a Force Will. I think I just misread one of the counterbalances earlier as a Force. So a counterbalance here, if he doesn't blind flip a 1, this crop rotation could actually just kill Brian next turn. So
Yeah. Well, Tom also, I believe, is contemplating responding to this counterbalance altogether.
Right. I mean, he just wants to get the Inkmoth Nexus into play regardless. So I think he's going to go ahead and do that here. Casting crop rotation, going to get Inkmoth Nexus, and hoping that there's not a 1 on top of Brian's deck for a blind flip. Because Brian doesn't look like he has a Force of Will. And so if his counterbalance doesn't blind flip, he's just dead next turn.
All right, so crop rotation resolves. And Tom goes and gets the Inkmoth Nexus.
Yeah, I mean, that's as expected. He does have other targets in his deck once he already has Inkmoth Nexus online. He has a Singleton Wasteland, potentially to protect against an opposing Wasteland before he actually puts his Inkmoth Nexus into play. He also has access to Pendlehaven as a 2x to give himself a little bit of sweetness.
All right. Tom is going for it here. Activates the Inkmoth Nexus.
And if there's not a good blind flip here, the game's just over.
The island on top of his deck.
All right.
Attacks with Nexus. 1 Berserk. And that is 1 + 4 × 2 is 10. And that is game 1. Tom Ross quickly up a game with his blue-green Infect deck. And I believe that Brian may have actually died with Swords to Plowshares in his hand.
No, I was an inline tutor.
Inline tutor. Sorry, it was a one-way card, but still a lot of gas left over in Brian's hand, and Tom able to win the game very quickly here. We're going to be coming back to the booth momentarily. Patrick Sullivan, Todd Anderson, and that was a good start to this elimination rounds, I would say.
I mean, it was quick. I mean, maybe we'll get to see some other matches and have, a pretty solid first round of the top 8. I mean, Tom very easily took that game. Brian's hand, not as great as he wanted, didn't have Sensei's Divining Top or spot removal spells, but we'll see how games 2 and 3 go.
So before we go into the sideboarding, it's trivia time.
Yes.
The way that this works is that I will ask a trivia question. You will tweet your answer at SCG Live. You will hashtag SCG Premium. Of the correct respondents, 1 will be selected at random to receive 3 free months of Star City Games Premium. Doesn't matter who responds first. We draw out of all the correct answers, so don't worry about having to be the first one to get your answer in. And my question for you is, we've been following Tom Ross's Infect deck all day long. The main deck has 12 creatures in it. 8 of them are green 1-mana creatures, and 1 of them is a blue 2-mana creature. Name that blue creature. So again, tweet your answer at SCG Live, hashtag SCG Premium, and one of you will receive 3 free months of Star City Games Premium, including content by this gentleman.
I'm going to guess. Can I just make a guess, a blind guess? I'm not looking at his deck list. Lord of Atlantis.
Incorrect.
Rats.
Going to the sideboard now, we're going to be going back and taking a look at what these guys have available. I'll give you your buddy's deck list, and you can give it a once-over.
All right. So we've seen BVD on camera twice today. He has a tutor package in his sideboard with Enlightened Tutor to go get things like Engineered Explosives, potentially Detention Sphere, but I don't think either of those cards are going to be too good in this matchup. Maybe if, Tom is reliant on the, Blighted Agents and the Glistener Elves, it could be a little different and just like main phase kill the things or whatever. But for the most part, I think he's probably going to be bringing in Wear and Tear because Inkmoth Nexus is the most important card in the matchup for Tom, I think, since, it's much harder to actually deal with and doesn't actually sit and play for Brian to terminus it much more easily. Having to, to draw step it, to do it on your opponent's turn with Sensei's Top is really important. So definitely going to bring in the 4 Swords to Plowshares. Maybe the Swan Song, since the damage from those is pretty irrelevant, and countering the pump spells is huge. A Pithy Needle, which can lock down Inkmoth Nexus, and I think that's about it.
On Tom's side, we have a Swan Song, a Dispel, a Relic of Progenitus, a Misdirection, a Bajuka Bog, a Dismember, a Submerge, a Viridian Corruptor, 2 Necropedes, a Berserk, a Sylvan Library, and a Nature's Claim. I expect the Sylvan Library to come in. We saw Tom also bring this card in against another slower opponent, gives him more gas and more ability to slog through removal spells. I anticipate some amount of the disenchant effects coming in as, certainly the equipment is still something that Tom needs to be mindful of here. And I like Dispel here as well as additional counterspell. Fight over Swords to Plowshares and other removal spells.
Yeah, I mean, that seems fine. Brian's deck is not really that susceptible to Daze, so I could easily see Daze coming out in the matchup just because Brian knows the list. He could play around it pretty easily. And Daze actually is just really good when it's in your sideboard when your opponent knows you have it, because then they play around it and you don't actually have to draw Daze.
Yeah.
It does its job for it.
You get the best of both worlds in a lot of spots.
Exactly. So, I mean, I could see those coming out. I think that it's really important to have the rest of the protective spells like Force of Will, since those are hard counters for things that, matter late in the game. I think the Stifle could be pretty huge on a Terminus at least one time. If I see it one time, it's going to be awesome. I did it once to Chi Hoi Yim in the finals of SCG Invitational Atlanta a couple years ago, and that was awesome.
Yeah.
It's a good feeling. And
a critical thing, it's a very small thing, but, the one Academy Ruins you see in Brian's list here, we think of those lands often as being kind of free rolls. They provide a lot of utility. The fact that it was a colorless land that game was critical. And if he had another source of blue mana, he could have played his counterbalance and had a white mana left over to cast Enlightened Tutor and possibly use the combination of those cards to fight over the lethal turn that Tom was able to generate.
Right, but I mean, then again, we also haven't seen any of the games today Brian played off camera where he could have potentially used Academy Ruins to rebuy Thopter Foundry, to rebuy, things like that, just like Engineer Explosives or other cards that hit the bin earlier in the game. Brian is playing just 22 lands. If you're going to play Academy Ruins, I might consider upping it to 23 and just using it as a virtual spell that kind of free rolls as an extra mana source sometimes. But, as we've discussed, this is a brew for Brian, and this is the first time he's played it. We've seen a little bit of a misstep from him here and there over the course of the day because he is newer with the deck and newer with Miracles in general, but the deck is obviously very strong. He 7-0-2 the Swiss and is playing here in the top 8, trying to lock up the Player of the Year race. So
yeah, and Brian Braun-Duin in an excellent position to snag that Season 1 point invite.
Yeah, there's only, 1 or 2 weekends left before the Invitational?
We have, next weekend, we're going to be in Richmond for the Grand Prix. The weekend after that, we're going to be in Seattle. The weekend after that, we're in Los Angeles. And then the final weekend in March is when we have the Invitational in Charlotte. So we have this and then 2 more opens, and then we'll be in Charlotte.
Cool.
The Invitational also counts for points for that season, so it's not a lot going into the event. The Invitational still matters. Remember, the winner of the event receives the invite alongside the overall point winner for Season 1. So shuffling up for Game 2 here. And I'm not even saying that the Academy Ruins is necessarily incorrect to have in Brian's deck, but just Legacy is a format where all the small details matter.
Right.
And it was critical in that game that that land was colorless rather than being a blue or white source of mana.
Yeah, and that is important to note because, like you said, the Enlightened Tutor could have stacked his deck with either the Blood Moon as a 3-mana enchantment to counter the Invigorate or potentially Berserk.
Both players shuffling here. Ready to get Game 2 underway. Another explosive opening from Tom Ross. We saw him on camera earlier. Updates from other sides of the bracket. We have Michael Majors up a game in the 2-7 matchup that we have off camera.
Yeah, and that's the Blue-Red-White Delver from Michael Majors versus Goblins, and Majors up a game, probably due to True Name Nemesis. I'm just going to guess on that one.
Possibly equipment played a part. Maybe bolts and Swords to Plowshares played a part. There's
Perhaps.
a lot of potential factors.
Perhaps. I'd actually really like to see Michael Majors in action. I know he was on camera earlier today. He's a really solid mage. He's only played in 2 or 3 Pro Tours. He has a top 16 or like top 25, I think. And he also came in second at Grand Prix Atlanta playing Legacy just a year and a half ago or so.
Yeah. Brian keeps it 7. Tom goes for Mulligan. Yeah, we had him on camera playing against Merfolk, and he just surgically took apart that deck. Bolts and Plows and True Name Nemesis and Umazawa's Jite. A nice recipe against Merfolk.
Yeah. They don't have many forms of card advantage, and sometimes they don't play Standstill, and when that's the case, you just 1-for-1 them to death all day, every day.
Merfolk, another deck that, when True Name Nemesis came out, people initially said Merfolk, that's the place it's going to go. Pretty obvious to understand why it is a Merfolk, but arguably, True Name Nemesis has actually caused more harm than good to Merfolk thus far.
Yeah, I mean, he's best buddies with Stoneforge Mystic. Just put an Umazawa's Jite on him and just go to town with True Name. And, I mean, you can eat up every Merfolk in existence. So, except maybe, is there some giant... what are the creature types that have all creature types?
Changelings.
Yeah, is there some giant changeling that doesn't die to Jite? I don't recall.
Tom Ross taking another mulligan here. I suspect there's at least some 4/4s for 5 or what have you.
Sure. So maybe a couple of times with just say to kill all the merfolk.
Chameleon Colossus.
There you go. That's that's the good one.
Right.
That is literally the best merfolk ever printed. Well, maybe not now because it's your name nemesis, but that was always the joke.
Yeah. Tom now on 5 cards. Really rough for Tom, of course, as he's trying to cobble together a saturation of spells. Kind of, he's much closer to a Storm deck than a Sneak and Show deck as far as if you want to describe his deck as a combo deck.
Right. It's actually pretty funny. I've heard multiple stories today from Tannen Grace and even Ruben Bressler where they mulliganed to 4 or less and won their game and match because of it. Or not because of it, but in spite of it.
So Tom keeps his 5-card hand, starts off the game on the draw with a Tropical Island and a Glistener Elf.
And here's the point where BBD wonders if he should play around Daze. And he does. Untaps draws. Probably going to main phase Swords of Plowshares to play around Vines of the Vastwood if he has Swords of Plowshares. But I assume that's what the tank at the end of the turn was.
Possibly Enlightened Tutor as well, something he's mulling over.
Sure. Yeah, that's a possibility. Even though Tom is on 5 cards, it's dangerous to let him untap because just how powerful Vines of the Vastwood can be. And as you see, it's in his hand along with a Pendlehaven, Inkmoth Nexus, Brainstorm, Viridian Corruptor fresh off the top, which could be important for dealing with a couple of random enchantments. And the last card, which I can't quite see, I think it's another Pump Spell.
So Glistener Elf coming into the red zone. Pendlehaven pumps. We'll see if any response here from Brian or if he's going to take 2 poison. Brian passes and 2 infect on Brian.
Yep. I know that we have the infect counter in our versus videos. I wonder if we have an infect counter.
Oh, we had it in St. Louis last week.
Okay.
Well, I know we're equipped.
Well, normally Tom just kills them out of nowhere, but there we go. We got the poison counter on there. Brian had 2 poison with an Enlightened Tutor, and that is more than likely what the tank was for turn 1.
So Brian Braun-Duin resolving Enlightened Tutor at the end of the turn here, at the end of Tom's turn rather, looking for, potentially Engineered Explosives, maybe Blood Boon could be in play. We'll see what he goes and gets.
Yeah, if he has another fetch land to go get Volcanic Island or just has the Volcanic naturally in hand, casting Blood Boon here wouldn't be all that bad, but Tom hasn't shown the Inkmoth Nexus on the first 2 turns, so Brian thinks it's probably safe to just get Engineering Explosives, cast it, and kill the Glistener Elf before any more damage is done. Unbeknownst to him, the Inkmoth Nexus in hand is going to be a bit problematic. Potentially the Viridian Corruptor too, just as a 2/2 body.
Yep. So Brian going and getting Engineered Explosives here at the end of the turn. Play will be back on Brian momentarily.
Yeah, from Tom's perspective, the mulligan to 5, obviously not an ideal start, but his draw on 5 cards is actually very good. He doesn't have any protective elements, but he does have a lot of ways to actually pressure Brian without committing too much to the board. A Terminus here wouldn't be very backbreaking. Swords of Plowshares wouldn't be that bad either. He does have the Vines of Vastwood to protect. Not really reliant on things like Force of Will right now because he's so low on cards. Does have access to Brainstorm here too.
So we see a Brainstorm here from Tom.
A couple lands and another Brainstorm. Unfortunately, since this is on Brian's turn, Tom is going to have to draw one of those cards. And he doesn't really want the Force, so he'll probably keep the fetch land. Hopefully use it next turn, but he may just... Actually, no, next turn he's probably going to cast Viridian Corruptor and fetch to get rid of that excess forest, even though he won't be able to put the Inkmoth Nexus into play.
On the other side of the bracket, Stephen Mann, our #1 overall seed, up game 1 against Justin Parenti.
Interesting play here from Tom, and I know this seems marginal, but he opted to draw the secondary card off the top of his deck, which is a basic forest, and decides to put the Inkmoth Nexus into play to apply more pressure to Brian's poison total. That dead draw could cost him later in the game, since I feel like Brian's hand does have a few different answers in it. The Wear and Tear, which we can see pretty plainly at the top, going to be able to take care of the Inkmoth Nexus quite handily, but he still has to find a way to deal with the Viridian Corruptor in some way or another.
And there is Humility. We brought this up earlier. Humility, of course, shuts down all creature abilities, but does not turn off Inkmoth Nexus.
Yeah, it's a weird layering effect where activating the Inkmoth Nexus kind of is on the same level as Humility, where it's giving a creature giving something the ability of becoming a creature with infect.
We might just be seeing lethal right here.
Oh, he had Invigorate as his last card, so.
And that is 9 points of infect damage coming across again.
I'm curious if Brian actually knows that this interaction works.
And that's it.
Yeah, geez.
No fuss, no muss. Tom Ross, 2 games to 0, blows through Braun-Duin. Who knows? It's not clear if he knew about the interaction or if that was just the best play he had to make. But Tom Ross, I think that Brian looks incredulous enough that he was not aware that was a thing.
Yeah, he's baffled.
He looks like he cannot believe that was a thing.